evening.
Evening.
And welcome to celebrating our local African American treasures. In 1746, Peter Wright settled in the area which was to be known as Covington. But the land for the site was purchased by Dr. James Mary and his brother Samuel Mary of Prince Edward County for the sum of $3,000 from Mr. George Pence, who sold them 138 acres in 1817. In 1818, the General Assembly designated the area as the town of Covington. However, Alleghany County was not established until 4 years later in 1822. The ground was given as a graveyard and dedicated to the public for that purpose by Robert Skeens, Andrew Fudge, William Cale, Samuel B. Lowry, and Harrison B. Silvley, by deed dated January 1st, 1839. Although there is still some speculation as to the exact date when Cedar Hill and the slave allotment were established, however, the first markers interred in Cedar Hill date back to 1839, that of Martha Frances Hobbs, daughter of James and Elizabeth Hobbs, who died at the age of 1 year old. There may be graves that predate this one, but rarely are there any seen earlier than this. The date of the slave allotment's establishment is still in question. However, its creation was for the interment of slaves and their descendants before emancipation. No other persons are to be buried there. The majority of the graves there are unmarked, except for a few who are descendants, buried in recent years. During the mid-50s, I remember the site with a white picket fence on one side and was lined along the back edge and left side with cedar trees. That was how we knew where the allotment was located. Now the fence is gone, and most of the cedar trees are dead or have been removed. This plot map was just found by Sam Hale, the archivist for the Alleghany Historic Society, in papers donated to the society by Karen Hammond, the wife of Charles Hammond. Charles' great-uncle was the local surveyor in Covington at that time. Amongst those papers were maps of Covington and surrounding areas, and this is one of those maps. You can see at the bottom center where land had been designated for colored burial. To date, no identifying marker exists at this historic site. Other cemeteries with slave interment in the area are John King Cemetery in Warring River, Kyle Slave Cemetery in Potts Creek, James Davis Slave Cemetery in Sinking Springs, Carnes Slave Cemetery in Lowmore, Red Hill Cemetery in Clifton, Oakland Grove Presbyterian Church in Selma. These are just a few of slave cemeteries in our area. But for the sake of time, I will focus on the last two, Red Hill and Oakland Grove. Located on Fairview Avenue, Clifton Forge, Red Hill Cemetery is one of the younger African American cemetery sites in the Highlands. It is not a slave cemetery because the majority of the interred are after slavery. However, there are a few individuals interred here that were born into colonial servitude and died as free persons. I think it is important to acknowledge those persons also in their struggle for freedom in this country. The oldest grave that I found here dates back to 1840. There may be others that are earlier than this, but because of broken stones, erosion, and missing markers, they have not been found. Oakland Grove Presbyterian Church is the oldest known church building in Alleghany County, and is one of the county's chief historic landmarks. Its cemetery has probably some of the best examples of marked slave graves in the local area. Oakland Grove is a simple brick house of worship, established in 1847 as a mission of the Covington Presbyterian Church. It was first called the Church by the Springs. During the Civil War, Confederates used the church as a hospital, and its military significance was further enhanced by the proximity of the Jackson River depot on the Virginia Central Railroad just to the east. Near the rear of the church and along the sides, there are some family plots that have slave markers in or near the family graves. It was customary that if a marker was inside the family plot, it meant that this was a very trusted servant, maybe a nanny or a house servant. If the marker was outside the plot, that meant that they were a field hand, but a trusted servant worthy to be buried near the family. Typically, slave markers are flat, smooth stones set up on end with no inscription. Oakland Church has a very good representation of slave markers. There may be even some that represent slave soldiers because of their location to the Confederate soldiers. It was a common practice that if a young man had a slave as his companion, that slave would go to war with his master. With the ending of the Civil War in 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery, coupled with the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which declared free blacks to be U.S. citizens, and nullifying black codes issued in former Confederate states that restricted their rights and freedoms, many freed blacks found themselves facing a new uncharted frontier, one of survival, independence, and self-reliance. However, there were some who fared much better than others because they had acquired certain skills and trades as slaves. When freed, they were not at the mercy of their masters. They were prepared. They knew how to be independent and to survive on their own because of their particular skills or trade. This was true of Archie Wright, a slave laborer on the Allen McAwee farm. The Allen McAwee farm was one of the largest farms in Alleghany County. At the time, approximately 28 slaves worked the farm. Over the years, parts of the farm, bit by bit, were sold off. On August 23, 1817, John Allen died and willed his estate to his daughter Rebecca Allen McAwee, who had married Charles M. McAwee January 5, 1859. Charlie was managing the farm for his father-in-law as the depot agent up until John's death. Archie Wright was a field worker under the tutelage of John Allen Sr. and later Charlie McAwee. Archie also did masonry work around the farm whenever needed. He was charged with the deliveries and pickups at the depot, where he learned how to barter and trade with some of the local landowners. This would prove valuable to his success later in life. Archie was married to Mary Robinson, who was a house servant born on the Allen farm. They met and married sometime after they were freed in the mid-1870s. The exact date is still inconclusive as to when they were married. However, Archie had settled and was farming in the Mill Almontrot area, just 2 miles outside of Covington in 1867, which would later become known as Wrightsville. In the Alleghany County Courthouse tax records, It records Archie as having amassed a certain amount of wealth for a freed black man of that period. It records him having 1 horse, 2 cows, 11 sheep, 3 hogs, 1 wagon, 2 watches, 1 clock, and 1 musical instrument. This is only 2 years after he received his freedom from the Allen McAwee farm. It also records him purchasing several parcels of land for his growing family and selling other pieces to other blacks who wanted to settle in the area. This area was later to be known as Wrightsville, which to this day is still the only black community remaining in Alleghany County. As the community grew, so did the need for a place of worship emerge. At the time, most of the families in Wrightsville were members of First Baptist Church in Covington and would walk into town to attend service there. However, as the winters became more difficult to traverse and the conditions of traveling back and forth in a segregated and sometimes hostile city, the need for a place of worship in Wrightsville community became more of a necessity for security and safety. In 1904, the members of the community began to meet at Reverend G.W. White's General Store, which had a meeting hall in the rear where services could be held. And when the weather would permit, services would be conducted outside under an arbor bush in the yard of the hall. The hall was located on the south side of Old Route 60 to 20, which is now Interstate 64 towards Mallow. The congregation met in Reverend White's hall for 2 years, after which a church was to be erected in 1906 on land that had been donated by Archie and Mary Wright. The building was constructed of white weatherboard siding on the exterior with blue, yellow, and burgundy lead glass windows. As the community grew, so did the need for children of the community to have educational instruction. However, there were no schools in the county or city for blacks. For a while, some classes were held in the hall of Reverend G.W. White, with classes being taught by Mrs. Delia Brown, and later in the basement of the new church where Mrs. Carrie Anderson Hembry taught. Somewhere around the late 30s, early 40s, a one-room school was built in Wrightsville to accommodate grades 1 through 3, where Mrs. Shepherdson and Mrs. Hembry taught. When the new extension of Highway Route 60 to 20 came through the community in 1945, the Wrightsville School was moved to the campus of the Watson School in Covington, where it was to be used as home economics and science building. In 1960, once again, the community changed when Interstate 64 divided the community and displaced nearly half of its residents, many of whom relocated to the far side of the community near the church, and others moved to the nearby cities of Covington, Clifton Forge, Lowmore, and Roanoke. In 1965, all the area white schools were integrated. No black schools remained open, and the children from the Wrightsville community were bused to nearby white schools in the county.